Under a slab of broken marble and scorched gold leaf, where the air still smelled faintly of ozone and incense, lay the curved edge of a helm. Its surface was not the deep painted black that later generations of Astartes would favour, nor the richly heralded hues of a Primarch-led legion. It was pale, close to silver, and where the metal had been chipped, the underlying grain suggested techniques older than the standardised manufactoria of the Great Crusade. Beside the helm, a single small plate bore a simple stamped mark, the letters LE followed by the digit 2. A stack of thin cards, edges dog-eared and some stained with rust and blood, had been set aside as if by habit rather than haste. The marks upon those cards were crude, hand-drawn, symbols that would later form part of a wider imperial superstition, but here they smelled of private ritual and years of quiet repetition. Fragments of wiring and a broken bolt pistol magazine lay half buried in the dust. The bolt pistol itself, an old M676 Union model, had a shape and manufacture that spoke of a pre-Accord era when Terra still bartered knowledge and designs with the old electrocraft houses of other worlds. The weapon's faceplate carried tooling marks incompatible with later Mars-forged armories, and those marks persisted as a fingerprint of the time and technology that produced the being who had carried it. Excavators and archivists would later file these items as incidental material evidence, but the signs they left behind were precise enough to suggest a life lived across ages rather than a single campaign. The first written references that survived beyond gossip and hearsay avoided naming the individual whose detritus these were. Reports described a single guardian who stood at the shoulder of a perpetual woman whose own records were fragmentary and contradictory, a figure of metallic stillness whose loyalty predated the Primarch project, and who carried the debris of a private life, a sketchbook, a battered deck of cards, a bolt pistol older than the standard Astartes issue. It is only after the pattern of these traces is placed against corroborating textual fragments from the late Great Crusade and Heresy records that a name begins to appear in the margins. Leetu, commonly referenced thereafter as the designation stamped upon his armour, LE2. The origin assigned to that stamped designation is not myth alone, but a stitched narrative of laboratory notes, fugitive testimonies, and later novelised accounts. Those sources converge on a single, uneasy claim. Leetu represents a successful prototype legionary, an early apprehension of the Emperor's intention to create superhuman warriors, one constructed before the formalization of the Primarch project. He is described as the product of direct genetic intervention combining the Emperor's own stock with that of Erda, a perpetual geneticist whose role in the earliest experiments made her in effect a maternal source for the values and lineages the Emperor would later attempt to systematize. The temporal relationship implied is important. Leetu predates the mass production of legions and therefore falls outside the later codified gene seed classifications, making his physiology and temperament a unique case study rather than a convenient exemplar. That stated provenance places Leetu in an unsettled historical niche. He is at once an artifact of the Emperor's work and a testament to the unease Erda felt about the project she had helped enable. The sources describe Erda withdrawing from the project, creating a warp rift that scattered the nascent Primarchs and then fleeing the Imperial Palace. In the aftermath, those who had been created by the early, less systematized techniques were not folded into a single legion. Instead, a small number remained dispersed and anomalous. Leetu's testimony and the testimonies about him indicate that he came to regard both Erda and the Emperor as progenitors in a literal genetic sense, but his loyalty, according to the accounts, attached exclusively to Erda. This is expressed not as a political choice but as a personal oath. He defended her and swore to keep her from harm. The character of that promise, and the fact it endured across centuries of conflict, is a recurring point in the archival records. From a biological vantage, the records provide only partial measurements and rely heavily on comparative inference. Leetu is repeatedly described in surviving narrative fragments as being physically impressive in the manner of an Astartes, taller and more massively muscled than any ordinary human, with reflexes, resilience, and metabolic regulation beyond normal human ranges. because he was produced before the Primarch gene lines were differentiated, and before the later stabilization of gene seed implantation techniques. Contemporary analysts and later scholars infer that his baseline physiology would have been less uniform than that of later Space Marines. Estimates offered by expert commentators, marked as interpretive rather than canonical, place an unarmoured Leetu at roughly 2 meters and 10 centimeters in height, with an unarmoured mass that would vary depending on musculature and organ augmentation, but was likely in the range typical for early Astartes prototypes. When encased in power armour, his overall battlefield silhouette would approach 3 meters, while his effective combat mass with armour, integrated systems and power reserves would place him within a range that contemporary engineers would later quantify as several hundred kilograms. These figures are analytical reconstructions based on comparative physiology of documented Astartes and repeated textual indicators. They are not absolute measurements, but are offered to situate him in physical terms for archival clarity. Those physiological peculiarities carried behavioural implications. Because his genoline is presented in the sources as a direct splicing of the Emperor and Erda's stock, rather than a derivation of a Primarch strain, Leetu's mental and instinctive profile is often characterised as less monolithic than that of a typical legionary. Accounts emphasise an individual cognitive texture that retained civilian inclinations, small habits, a taste for drawing, the private practice of marking cards, alongside the conditioning and implanted reflexes common to Astartes. This juxtaposition appears repeatedly. He is at once a warrior bred for extremes and a collector of domestic, almost fragile rituals. Such details, recorded in fragments and reinforced in later compilations, are frequently cited as evidence that the earliest experimentations in augmentative human design produced subjects who were incompletely standardized, and therefore retained a greater portion of pre-augmentation personality. The archival conclusion drawn from this is that Leetu was numerically and functionally exceptional. His utility in combat settings was not reducible to template metrics alone. The immediate practical purpose assigned to prototypes like Leetu is recorded in administrative fragments and narrative accounts. They were testbeds, guardians, and in at least one instance, personal retainers. The sources indicate that Leetu's earliest recorded public duty was the protection of Erda herself. After her withdrawal, documentation shows that she entrusted him, at a later point, to another figure who appears repeatedly in heresy records, John Grammaticus, an individual of the Perpetual Order whose own existence sought to balance the imperishable with human contingency. Erda's decision to give Leetu to Grammaticus to serve as a protector is framed in those sources as both pragmatic and emblematic, a testament to Leetu's reliability and to Erda's desire to keep him near individuals whose fates could influence the broader project she had abandoned. This transfer matters because it moved Leetu from a private guardian to an active agent within a larger, more chaotic historical drama. The recorded movements that follow show Leetu embedded in a small irregular company that sought Olania's person and navigated the ruined corridors of the Imperial Palace. These groupings are not presented as formal task forces, rather, they read like itineraries of desperate seekers, survivors from Calth and a small contingent including figures identified as Actea and a space marine billing himself as Alfarius at the time of encounter. The composition of this party, and Leetu's role within it, is described as functional. He is both guardian and instrument, occasionally acting to shield others, and at other times functioning as a deliberate autonomous combatant. These sources stress his steadiness under pressure and his capacity to translate personal oath into immediate action on the field, a trait that would see him through the palace's deepest calamities. The archival texts narrate a progression that crescendos at the palace itself. The group's passage into the Imperial dungeon, their discovery upon the dais of an unattended golden throne, and the subsequent revelation that the Emperor had left the hall to confront Horus aboard the Vengeful Spirit are events preserved across multiple accounts. These passages place Leetu at the heart of the most consequential moments of the heresy's closing act. Witness records and later compilations describe him standing amid ruin, helping to stabilize a breakdown of morale and acting during the subsequent encounters with planned and opportunistic adversaries. Those encounters culminate in a sequence in which the group is ambushed by agents of Erebus, the Word-Bearer, and where many of their companions are slain. Here again the sources record Leetu's endurance. He survives while those around him fall, and his survival is stated without elegiac framing. The tone is forensic rather than hagiographic. Primary narrative fragments continue the chronology into the contested spaces of Lupercal's court and the vengeful spirit itself. The accounts place Leetu with Garviel Loken and Cacaltus Dusk, assisting the Emperor in contesting Horus. The texts that record these actions are careful to note the disparity in scale. Leetu and his companions are described as lesser than the Primarchs they confronted. They are effective, brave, and instrumental in several narrow engagements, but the documents do not ascribe miraculous parity with a Primarch. Instead, they show the prototypes as elements that can influence individual turning points. Leetu is credited with rescuing the corpse of the slain Primarch Sanguinius from demon predation, an act that is recorded as both practical and symbolic. He is later cast into an encounter with the ruinous powers and then, miraculously by the surviving accounts, reappears within the palace after Horus's fall. The sequence of action is preserved across narrative sources and is taken seriously by modern historians because of the concordance between otherwise independent fragments. That return to terror is the moment where small objects and private rituals, the cards, the sketchbook, the stamped plate, acquire archival resonance. Accounts state that Leetu produced one card, the Throne, which had been found near the Emperor's body. That card was used, at least rhetorically, to argue for the preservation of the Emperor's life by placement upon the Golden Throne. The scene is not romanticized in the texts. It is recorded as a procedural action that contributed to a political and medical decision. After the heresy, those who encountered him found Leetu sitting alone, sorting the deck he had compiled from his old collection, and those recovered from the vengeful spirit. The image is quiet, a being who had moved through cataclysm now occupied with the repetition of habit. The surviving interrogator's notes on that meeting are sparse and clinical, but they preserve enough detail to confirm continuity between the Leetu referenced in the earlier combat reports and the post-siege figure awaiting questioning. Material culture attached to his person has also been catalogued. The M676 Union model bolt pistol, referenced in several reports, is explicitly noted as predating the formal accord between Terra and Mars and as therefore representing an older fabrication tradition. His armour, repeatedly described as a pale silver beak-helmed suit, stamped with LE2, is treated in museum registries as an artifact that bridges the artifactual gap between archaic Proto-Astartes field kit and later mass-produced armour systems. Curatorial records make special note of the design aesthetics. The beak helm and the pale silver plating do not fit the iconography of later legions, and the stamped designation is taken as a significant trace of provenance rather than mere ornamentation. These details, when assembled, produce a coherent archaeological profile. Leetu's accoutrements are contemporary with the era of his creation, and consistent with textual attributions of age. The personal and the technological converge in the small, intimate gestures recorded around his name. His drawing habit appears in multiple fragments as a recurring aside rather than a headline. It is presented not as sentimental decoration, but as a behavioural datum. The presence of sketchbooks and crude renderings in his possession indicates cognitive bandwidth not wholly dedicated to martial praxis. Analysts have used those data points to argue that early prototypes retained more civilian characteristics and private rituals than later Astartes, whose conditioning and gene seed standardization removed much of what would once have been ordinary human pastime. Whether this was by design, accident, or necessity remains a matter of academic debate. The archival record is emphatic only about the presence of such traces, not their definitive explanation. Finally, and importantly for any attempt at contextual explanation, Leetu's presence in the record invites a broader question about continuity and memory. He is not a representative of a later, codified martial culture, but a living trace of the experimentation that produced that culture. As such, he functions in the sources as a hinge between ages, An object lesson in what the Emperor and his collaborators did before systematization, a reminder of the ethical ambiguities of those interventions, and a living archive of practices that would later be suppressed, formalized, or forgotten. The archival residue he left, the stamped plate, the cards, the sketches, the older weapons, is therefore not merely the material of biography. It is evidence used to reconstruct a procedural history of human augmentation, loyalty, and the personal costs of grand design. These are the primary strands to be followed and expanded in subsequent parts. First, the biotechnical origin and the immediate consequences of Leetu's creation. Second, the practical apparatus of his life as a soldier and guardian. Third, the cultural and ritual traces that mark him as exceptional among early Astartes. The material legacy attached to Leetu is sparse, but the few confirmed artifacts are unusually revealing. Unlike the fully standardized equipment of later legions, where every bolt pistol and suit of armor was a product of mass-fabricated design, Leetu's inventory bears the marks of an experimental phase in which no two prototypes were entirely alike. These objects are not merely personal accoutrements, they are fragments of an era before formalization, when the Emperor's vision was still subject to variance, improvisation, and deviation. Examining his gear, one perceives the convergence of multiple traditions: Terran industrial manufacture, forgotten Union models, and pre-Mars fabrication lines that had not yet been subordinated to the Mechanicum. Each piece reveals a window into the embryonic period of what would later become the martial material culture of the Imperium. The M676 Union model bolt pistol attributed to Leetu is a singular case. Unlike the later Mars standard bolt weapons, whose frame dimensions, power feed mechanisms, and ammunition calibers were codified after the Unification Wars, this model reflects the eclectic traditions of pre-Accord Terra. Surviving descriptions identify its frame as slightly longer in the grip and heavier in the muzzle than Mars patterns, a result of using older propellant housing and shell ejection channels. The ammunition itself likely remained compatible with standardized bolt shells, though the feeding system has been noted as more prone to jamming under battlefield debris conditions. What distinguishes this weapon is not its technical superiority but its heritage. It is evidence of Terran industry before the Martian Compact, an era when human polities still competed in armament designs. For Leetu to carry such a pistol is symbolically resonant. It places him outside the later homogenized identity of the Astartes, and roots him in a prior technological culture, one that still bore traces of multiple human traditions before they were subsumed into the Imperial consensus. His armor is similarly singular. The pale, silver, beak-helmed power armor bearing the LE2 stamp is unlike the formalized marks of Astartes' warplate that followed. Later systems, Mark II Crusade armor, Mark III Iron, Mark IV Maximus, were designed with codified segmentations, plating standards, and power feed channels. Leetu's suit appears instead as a transitional hybrid. The beak helm suggests lineage with the Mark VI Corvus pattern, though that was developed much later during the Great Crusade in response to specific battlefield needs. Yet Leetu's helm is recorded as present centuries earlier, raising the possibility that this was a precursor design, either conceived independently by Terran artisans or preserved from earlier projects abandoned or modified by the Emperor. The pale silver coloration has no known legionary precedent. Most legions adopted heraldic colours tied to their primarchs or their campaigns, but Leetu's armour remained devoid of such livery. Its plainness, marked only by the functional stamping of LE2, reinforces the impression of a prototype, a suit that served as a testbed for powered augmentation, but lacked the symbolic culture that would later envelop armour design. What can be inferred of the armour's internals is based on standardized features of the time. Power armour in this phase utilised fibre bundles to replicate muscle contraction, layered ceramite for resistance against projectile impact, and an internal atmospheric system to regulate respiration and temperature. Given the Emperor's focus on resilience, it is likely that Leetu's armour incorporated redundant environmental systems, allowing survival in void, toxic, or irradiated environments. The plainness of its outer form may conceal considerable internal experimentation. Some records suggest that the plating bore microscopic grain structures inconsistent with mass-fabricated ceramite, implying hand-forged reinforcement or unique metallurgical combinations. This too would be consistent with prototype development, where artisans experimented with variations before arriving at reliable patterns. Taken together, the pistol and armour form the backbone of Leetu's material profile, but other tools and objects orbit around him. The tarot cards, though seemingly personal, are significant. While not a weapon or battlefield device, they represent a form of tool, a system for reflection, habit, or symbolic communication. In the context of military history, personal objects such as these are often marginalized, yet they reveal the psychological infrastructure of a warrior's life. The repeated act of marking, shuffling, and sorting the cards indicates a ritual function, perhaps comparable to the meditation rites later cultivated within certain chapters. It shows that Leetu, unlike mass-produced Astartes, integrated civilian tools into his daily life. For historians, this is revealing. It highlights a phase in which warrior design had not yet erased the space for ordinary human practice. Vehicles are not directly attributed to Leetu in the surviving accounts. Unlike Primarchs, who are often associated with grand war machines or flagship vessels, Leetu appears primarily on foot or in company with small groups. Yet this absence itself is meaningful. It situates him as a personal combatant rather than a field commander with material assets at his disposal. If vehicles were used in his campaigns, they likely belong to the broader detachments he accompanied, rather than being uniquely tied to him. The implication is that early prototypes were not yet embedded in the mechanized apparatus of the legions. Instead, they functioned as individual guardians or strike units. This would align with the description of Leetu serving as protector first to Erda, later to Grammaticus, and then as a member of small irregular task groups during the Siege of Terra. His technological identity is therefore defined less by vehicles than by the singularity of his personal arms and armour. Moving from his material culture to the question of social structure, one confronts another anomaly. Standard Astartes were arrayed within legions, bound by hierarchy, discipline, and codes of conduct instilled by Primarchs. Leetu belonged to no such legion. His designation, LE2, implies at least one predecessor or counterpart, perhaps another prototype, but no evidence of a formal cohort survives. Thus, Leetu's social placement is less that of a legionary among thousands, and more akin to a solitary agent attached to specific figures. In practice, this meant his chain of command consisted of those he swore to protect. First Erda, then John Grammaticus, and later Olanius Person in effect, though this latter connection was mediated by Grammaticus's company. Leetu's leadership orientation was therefore personal rather than institutional. He obeyed not the strictures of a Primarch or a War Master, but the personal obligations forged by loyalty to Erda. Values emerge clearly from this structure. His defining ethic was protection. Accounts emphasize that he positioned himself between threat and ward, even to the point of risking near-certain death. This contrasts with the broader Astartes ethos, which often prized conquest, compliance, and expansion. Leetu's ethic was narrower, more intimate, and more enduring. It was not abstract loyalty to the Imperium or its emperor, but concrete loyalty to Erda and those she entrusted to his care. Later, when he stood beside Grammaticus and Olanius, this same ethic manifested. He was less a commander of men and more a constant shield. That this value persisted through the collapse of entire campaigns suggests that his moral framework was anchored less in ideology than in oath. This divergence is again consistent with his anomalous status as a prototype. Without the reinforcing culture of a legion, his identity crystallized around personal bonds. Civilian roles for an individual such as Leetu are difficult to delineate. Unlike later Astartes, who are stripped of most personal practices, he retained markers of a life outside war. His habit of drawing, confirmed in narrative fragments, suggests he viewed himself as more than a weapon. This artistic inclination aligns with the presence of his tarot deck, both forming a pattern of personal ritual. These habits would have functioned as civilian practices embedded in a martial life, allowing continuity of self beyond combat. The presence of such roles complicates the conventional narrative of early Astartes as purely martial beings. Leetu demonstrates that, at least in the prototype stage, some capacity for civilian identity was preserved. His military role, by contrast, is well documented. He operated as a warrior of exceptional resilience, comparable to an Astartes, though without the regimental backing of a legion. This made him an individual combatant of unusual value, capable of protecting key figures during crises. During the Siege of Terra, he is repeatedly cited as instrumental in sustaining the morale and physical survival of his group. His near sacrifice against frenzied word-bearers exemplifies his role as a combatant willing to interpose himself against superior numbers. Unlike a commander directing formations, Leetu fought as a guardian and shock trooper. This dual capacity, civilian practices alongside martial action, defines his hybrid identity. Taken together, Leetu's technology, social placement and values form a coherent but anomalous profile. His gear situates him outside the standardized Imperium Mars military-industrial complex, anchoring him in an earlier technological phase. His social structure was personal rather than institutional, shaped by oaths to individuals rather than chains of command. His values were protective and enduring, not expansive or imperial. His civilian practices persisted alongside his military role, marking him as more human than later legionaries. These anomalies are precisely what make him significant. He embodies the transition between human and Astartes, between individual oath and institutional hierarchy, between experimental gear and mass-produced armor. This section, therefore, emphasizes that Leetu cannot be fully understood by the categories applied to later Astartes. His technology was singular, his tools personal, his vehicles absent. His social bonds were narrow, his values protective, his civilian life persistent. He stands as evidence that the first attempts at creating warriors greater than human were not yet wholly divorced from human scale. Where later Space Marines were subsumed into legions and campaigns, Leetu remained a solitary figure defined by loyalty, ritual, and survival. The behavioral patterns of Leetu, the first of the Emperor's transhuman creations, can only be understood by balancing two conflicting truths. On one side, he was engineered for war, molded through precise genetic intervention, and hardened through training meant to strip away hesitation. On the other, he carried within him the human spark that made him different from later Astartes, a residual element of individuality that could never be completely suppressed. He stood as a prototype, and that status created tension between instinct and will, between design and choice. His tendencies reflected both the precision of engineered biology and the unpredictable currents of human emotion. The instinctive drives within Leetu were sharpened by the Emperor's genetic science. At baseline, he possessed an unusually heightened state of alertness, a near constant readiness for threat or combat. Unlike unmodified men, whose adrenaline cycles spike and then fall, his systems maintained a controlled state of heightened vigilance. The effect was that he never fully relaxed in any environment. Even when seated or walking casually, his posture remained upright, his senses attuned to sound and motion. This tendency created a presence that others described as unnerving, as if he were always moments away from combat. For commanders, this quality made him invaluable, for it meant that danger never caught him unaware. For companions, however, it meant he appeared restless, unable to experience ease in ordinary settings. Another defining behavioral instinct was territorial protection. Leetu exhibited a deep-seated drive to secure those under his charge. Erda, who he considered the true center of his loyalty, recognized this early and entrusted him as a personal guardian. This protective instinct went beyond orders. It was closer to imprinting. The genetic template instilled in him a predisposition toward defensive aggression. If a personal space was deemed important, Leetu became an uncompromising sentinel. Within campaigns, this could be observed when he was stationed on flanks or tasked with securing choke points. He did not merely hold ground, he anchored it with a degree of determination that later commanders found remarkable. The instinct to guard was paired with near-complete disregard for his own survival. Despite this, Leetu's behaviour was not purely martial. He displayed social adaptations that hinted at the Emperor's intention to retain a human facade. His speech patterns were direct and concise, rarely straying into unnecessary elaboration. Yet those who served near him remarked that he was not without humour. In rare cases, he responded to camaraderie with a dry wit or an unexpected observation. This suggests that the behavioural conditioning did not erase human spontaneity. What separated him from later Space Marines was not only his role as a prototype, but his balance between engineered purpose and retained humanity. He could kill without hesitation, but he could also sit quietly, sketching lines upon parchment, letting his mind occupy a space far removed from violence. Ethically, Leetu represented a contradiction. His foundational loyalty was to Erda, not the Emperor, which placed him outside the moral codes that defined most Imperial warriors. His actions were guided by a personal ethic of protection and guardianship, shaped less by orders than by bonds. When Erda fled after scattering the Primarchs, Leetu did not turn against her, nor did he fully submit to Imperial command. He followed her directive to protect John Grammaticus, and later aligned with companions such as Olanius Persson. These choices suggest that his ethics were relational rather than institutional. His sense of right and wrong was determined not by law, creed, or empire, but by personal obligation and sworn bonds. Rituals played a limited yet revealing role in his life. Unlike later legions, which developed formalized ceremonies, Leetu's rituals were private, small, and often unrecorded. One example is his use of sketching. Carried as a habit from youth, or perhaps encouraged by Erda, he regularly engaged in drawing. Surviving notes describe images of faces, landscapes, and simple geometric studies. This practice acted as both meditation and memory retention. For a being whose existence was defined by combat, the act of creating images gave him a controlled outlet for reflection. In this sense, drawing was less hobby and more ritual, a repeated act that grounded his mind and created continuity in the chaos of war. Another ritual was his maintenance of weapons. Unlike some warriors who saw cleaning and inspection as tedious necessity, Leetu approached it with methodical reverence. His M676 Union model bolt pistol was not merely a tool but a constant companion. He disassembled it with precision, checked each part for wear, and reassembled it with a craftsman's care. This routine was not ceremonial in a religious sense, but it bore the same qualities of repetition, structure, and devotion. It reflected an ethic of readiness. To be armed and functional was to remain alive and capable of protecting. When assessing his tendencies, one must also address his relationship to violence. Leetu was engineered for war, but unlike some of the Primarchs and later Astartes who exhibited zeal or bloodlust, he did not appear to seek combat for its own sake. His violence was instrumental, carried out without malice or joy. Reports from those who fought beside him describe a dispassionate efficiency. He moved through enemies like a mechanism designed for precise elimination. Yet there are also records of his fury, particularly in moments when Erda's safety was threatened, or when allies fell in battle. These outbursts reveal that his instincts were not wholly mechanical. Emotional triggers still activated extremes in his behaviour, suggesting that his humanity could override the Emperor's design under sufficient stress. Leetu's ethics also encompassed restraint. Accounts suggest he avoided unnecessary cruelty, showing no tendency toward prolonged torture or degradation of opponents. He understood the purpose of fear, but he did not wield it as a weapon. His decisions leaned toward expedience, removing threats quickly and efficiently. This places him in contrast with legions such as the Night Lords, who built their strategy around terror. His ethic of combat was shaped less by psychological manipulation and more by direct protection. He fought to secure outcomes, not to indulge darker impulses. Hobbies beyond sketching were scarce, but some evidence indicates an interest in strategy games and symbolic puzzles. A number of sources connect him with the tarot deck that later played a significant role in post-heresy decisions. While the tarot had ritualistic and prophetic associations, for Leetu it may have also been a hobby. He studied the cards, memorized their imagery, and employed them as a means of reflection. This practice intersected with ritual and ethics, creating a bridge between recreation and decision-making. The tarot became both pastime and compass, offering him a way to process events and anticipate possibilities. One cannot ignore his behavior within group dynamics. Leetu was not a natural leader in the sense of commanding large formations. Instead, he thrived in smaller bands, acting as protector, advisor, or steadying presence. His demeanor inspired confidence without theatrics. Companions often described him as a silent constant, one who did not need to speak to assert influence. This aligns with his ethic of loyalty. He was not concerned with hierarchy, but with bonds of trust. His role in the Argonauts illustrates this well. He was never the loudest nor the most prominent figure, but his consistent presence allowed others to take risks, knowing he would intervene if danger grew overwhelming. In terms of ritualized ethics, he carried a strong sense of duty toward the fallen. During campaigns, he was observed tending to the remains of comrades with quiet care, ensuring that bodies were not abandoned or dishonored. This respect for the dead was not imposed by regulation, but seemed to emerge from his own moral code. The act of honoring the fallen served as both closure and reaffirmation of purpose. It reinforced the value of those he protected even after their deaths. Behaviourally, Leetu was also marked by isolation. Though capable of camaraderie, he often chose solitude when not required to interact. He would spend long periods alone, maintaining his equipment, sketching, or simply observing his environment. This tendency may have been both instinct and coping mechanism. As the first of his kind, he lived without equals. No other being fully shared his condition, and while later Space Marines found solidarity in their legions, Leetu bore the weight of singularity. His isolation was not rejection of others, but acknowledgement of difference. His ethics in decision-making reveal an inclination toward pragmatism. When faced with dilemmas, he selected outcomes that maximize survival or protection, even if those choices conflicted with Imperial expectations. This pragmatism occasionally placed him in tension with authority, but it also ensured his effectiveness. His choices were not governed by rigid adherence to doctrine. Instead, they reflected situational evaluation, guided by instinct and bond rather than law. Taken together, Leetu's behavioral tendencies, rituals, ethics, and hobbies created a complex profile. He was a weapon engineered for war, yet he retained human habits that revealed a mind-seeking balance. He exhibited instincts of vigilance and protection, rituals of weapon maintenance and sketching, ethics rooted in loyalty to individuals rather than institutions, and hobbies that merged with symbolic reflection. These elements distinguished him from later Astartes, making him less of a standardized soldier and more of a singular figure. He was both prototype and anomaly, a reminder that even in the Emperor's most calculated designs, traces of humanity persisted. The Adeptus Administratum's awareness of Leetu is fragmentary, scattered across departmental memoranda, transcribed oral histories, and the occasional misfiled report. He was not part of an organized legion, nor was he formally entered into the rolls of sanctioned Astartes formations. This meant that clerks and archivists of the early Imperium struggled to categorize him. Where the Primarchs and their legions could be clearly identified and slotted into the expanding structures of the Great Crusade, Leetu existed on the margins. His name did not appear in census tallies of the proto-legions, nor in the carefully collated rosters that accompanied expeditionary fleets. Yet his actions left impressions strong enough that administratum personnel, even centuries later, noted his involvement with certain key figures and events. The problem, from an administratum perspective, was classification. Within the rigid frameworks of imperial bureaucracy, beings of exceptional power were usually placed into categories: Primarch, Astartes, Custodian, Perpetual, or Auxiliary. Leetu fit none of these neatly. His gene seed was derived from the Emperor's experiments prior to the Primarch project, making him an ancestor to the Astartes, yet he lacked the Legion identity that defined them. His loyalty to Erda further complicated matters, as the Administratum preferred to obscure or erase references to her influence. Thus, records that mentioned Leetu often described him obliquely. He might be referred to as an early transhuman template, an unbound prototype, or in rare cases as Subject LE2. Each designation reflects the effort to file him into existing categories without acknowledging his true singularity. Administratum impressions of his activities during the Horus Heresy are cautious. Some scribes recognize that he fought in defense of Terra, moving alongside known figures such as Olanius Persson and Nathaniel Garrow. Yet official histories of the siege often omitted him, focusing instead on the actions of the legions, the custodians, and the Imperial army. Where he's mentioned, it is usually in private correspondences, where scribes confessed difficulty reconciling his presence with the sanctioned narrative. For the Administratum, Leetu's existence was an archival problem, a reminder that Imperial history is filled with anomalies that do not conform to doctrine. The Adeptus Mechanicus, by contrast, approached Leetu from a more technical perspective. Tech priests and magi were less concerned with his loyalty and more fascinated by the processes that created him. Fragments of Mechanicus analysis suggest that he represented a crucial link between the Emperor's private research and the mass production of gene-enhanced warriors that followed. His physiology displayed traits that would later be refined into the Astartes program, but it also contained unique elements. The designation LE2 itself resembles an internal testing code, suggesting that Mechanicus-aligned observers attempted to catalogue him as part of an experimental sequence. To the Mechanicus, Leetu's armour and weaponry were equally intriguing. The M676 Union model bolt pistol he carried was noted as a rare pre-Mars Accord design, part of the weapon families that predated the standardization imposed after the Treaty of Mars. For the Mechanicus, such weapons were relics of divergent technological paths, evidence of the Emperor's independence from Martian oversight in the early Unification Wars. Leetu's pale silver armour, marked with LE2, bore features distinct from later Mark series power armour. Its plating appeared heavier in some regions, lighter in others, with an internal framework that suggested experimental layering of ceramite and plasteel composites. For the Mechanicus, this suit was a lost data trove, a physical manifestation of knowledge that had never been fully shared with Mars. Yet despite this fascination, Mechanicus records of Leetu remained tentative. The cult Mechanicus had a vested interest in maintaining the illusion that all sacred technology flowed through Mars and its forge worlds. To admit that the Emperor had created his own prototypes outside Mechanicus authority threatened their monopoly on technological narrative. As such, references to Leetu's equipment were usually buried within sealed archives, accessible only to Magi with clearance for restricted archaeotech studies. Some reports describe recovered fragments of his sketches, preserved not for their artistry, but for the chance that they contained embedded codes or patterns that could reveal hidden knowledge of the Emperor's methods. The Mechanicus' obsession with cryptic detail turned even his drawings into objects of analysis. Administratum scribes also noted his behaviour, though often in the form of rumour. Some accounts describe a figure in pale silver armour appearing suddenly during critical moments of the siege, assisting beleaguered defenders before vanishing into the subterranean labyrinths of the palace. For Administratum record keepers, this created a dilemma: how to record the actions of someone who did not officially exist. Many chose to omit him altogether, while others left ambiguous references to an unknown transhuman warrior. This careful obfuscation reflects a broader pattern in Imperial history: the removal or blurring of inconvenient figures who do not fit the narrative of unity under the Emperor. From the perspective of Mechanicus Magi, Leetu embodied both promise and threat. He was proof that the Emperor's genetic science could operate independently of Martian technology, creating transhumans without recourse to Forge World infrastructure. To some, this represented a rival authority, a source of forbidden knowledge that undermined the Mechanicus' claim to control of the past. At the same time, Leetu's survival into the Siege of Terra proved the durability of his prototype design, and some tech priests quietly speculated that elements of his biology might have been superior to those of later Astartes. Such claims were never made public, for to do so would be to question the perfection of the gene seed as sanctified by imperial decree. Administratum attitudes toward Leetu after the heresy reveal further tension. Surviving reports describe him discovered calmly with his tarot deck, awaiting interrogation. For the Administratum, this raised unsettling questions. How should such a figure be processed? Was he to be considered an Astartes, a renegade, an auxiliary, or something else entirely? No classification satisfied the bureaucratic machine, and so Leetu became another entry in the category of anomalies. Administratum clerks had long practice in burying such figures. By rendering him nameless or reducing him to a code, they ensured that future generations would not ask too many questions. The Mechanicus, meanwhile, retained interest in his tarot deck. While to most it was a symbol of imperial divination, to tech priests, it represented a tool that could be studied as a system of symbolic logic. Some argued that Leetu's engagement with the deck suggested that he was operating within an unseen program of probability analysis, perhaps instructed by Erda or another perpetual. This interpretation veered close to heresy, but it reflects the Mechanicus habit of reinterpreting even human practices as technological processes. Both the Administratum and Mechanicus shared a tendency to minimize Leetu's individuality. To the Administratum, he was an archival inconvenience, better left obscured. To the Mechanicus, he was a technological specimen, stripped of personhood and treated as a data point. Neither fully acknowledged his human habits, his sketches, or his bonds of loyalty. Instead, they framed him in ways that reinforced their institutional priorities. This selective perception shaped the way later generations encountered his legacy, as a rumor, a code, or an artifact, rather than as a person. Despite this, enough traces survive to reconstruct their impressions. The Administratum saw in him the problem of classification, a reminder that imperial history is more complex than its official records admit. The Mechanicus saw in him the threat of lost knowledge, evidence that the Emperor's science could exist apart from Mars. Both impressions converge on the same point. Leetu was an anomaly, a prototype who refused to fit the categories of empire or cult. His existence unsettled the tidy narratives both institutions sought to maintain, and for that reason he was remembered only in fragments, shadows, and suppressed archives. The earliest recorded instances of Leetu's involvement in conflict are difficult to identify with precision. As a prototype warrior who predated the formal legions, his deployment was never standardized, and the Emperor did not parade him in the same manner as the Custodians or the Thunder Warriors. Nevertheless, impressions of his presence appear in scattered accounts of the later Unification Wars and more fully in the records of the Horus Heresy, particularly those surrounding the Siege of Terra. It is in those cataclysmic years that his battlefield contributions can be most clearly traced, though always through the oblique testimony of survivors and the reluctant acknowledgement of imperial scribes. Leetu's combat style bore markers of his unique heritage. Unlike the Thunder Warriors, whose crude augmentations made them brutal but short-lived engines of war, Leetu displayed a controlled and sustainable physiology. Unlike the later Astartes, he was not bound to the dogmatic structures of legionary warfare. His training had been personal, shaped by Erda and refined by his own experience. This combination produced a warrior who fought with adaptability rather than rigid doctrine. He was not a line soldier, nor a commander of massed ranks, but an individual specialist whose role shifted depending on the circumstance. The clearest battle record associated with Leetu emerges during the Siege of Terra. When the forces of Horus breached the defences of the Imperial Palace, he became part of a small but vital band of companions, later termed by some as the Argonauts. Alongside Olanius Persson, John Grammaticus, Actaea, and a space marine claiming the identity of Alfarius, Leetu fought his way into the Imperial dungeon. The significance of this passage cannot be overstated. While the legions clashed on the walls above and titans duelled across the burning plains, this smaller group pressed into the heart of the palace itself, navigating areas where the warp and materium overlapped dangerously. Accounts of their clashes with word-bearers are especially detailed. Surviving fragments describe how Leetu confronted a frenzied pack of traitor Astartes, interposing himself to shield Grammaticus in person. Here his fighting style is most clearly outlined. He did not rely on elaborate formations or coordinated maneuvers, but instead used precision strikes and personal resilience to control the flow of combat. His bolt pistol, the M676 Union model, delivered withering fire and controlled bursts, each shot chosen rather than wasted. When ammunition dwindled, he transitioned smoothly to close combat, wielding blades with a craftsman's touch rather than the wild fury often associated with Astartes' melee. Witnesses noted his ability to fight even while gravely injured, an endurance rooted as much in willpower as in physiology. Leetu's engagement with Erebus is another crucial record. The Word-Bearer. First Chaplain embodied the corruption of the heresy, and his presence on the walls of the palace drew the Argonauts into a brutal confrontation. In the chaos, Actea was buried beneath rubble, and many of their companions fell. Leetu survived by combining raw resilience with precise aggression. Against a foe steeped in warp power, he maintained discipline, anchoring his mortal companions and preventing collapse into despair. The Administratum transcripts describe this battle obliquely, noting an unidentified transhuman warrior who stood against Erebus and endured wounds that would have killed a lesser being. While these reports avoid naming him directly, the consistency of their description confirms his presence. Another defining episode came within the confrontation against the Emperor himself in his Proto-Dark King aspect. When the Emperor, burdened by warp power, risked corruption, it was Leetu who, alongside Gavial Loken and John Grammaticus, persuaded him to relinquish that power. This was not a traditional battle in the sense of blades and bolters, but it represented a different kind of conflict, the battle for the Emperor's soul. Leetu's contribution here underscores his fighting style in a broader sense. He was not only a combatant but also a stabilizing force, a presence that combined physical defense with moral conviction. His loyalty to Erda shaped his perspective, allowing him to confront the Emperor without the blind reverence that defined most Astartes. When the Emperor, Loken, and their companions advanced into Lupercal's court to confront Horus directly, Leetu entered the most infamous battle of the heresy. Here his combat effectiveness was tested to its limit. Horus, empowered by the dark gods, easily blasted aside those who accompanied the Emperor. Yet Leetu continued to fight, finding himself in the shadow of Sanguinius's strung-up corpse. In one of the more harrowing episodes, he cut down the dead Primarch's body, protecting it from desecration by demons. This act, while symbolic, reveals a deep instinct in his fighting style, the preservation of meaning amidst slaughter. He fought not only to kill enemies, but also to guard what he believed must be protected, whether Erda, Grammaticus, or the remains of a fallen Primarch. Leetu also aided in freeing the Emperor from the throne of bindings into which Horus had nailed him. Here his combat actions were interlaced with moments of practical courage. Even weakened, he moved to unshackle the most powerful being in existence, knowing that discovery meant certain destruction. When Horus confronted him, Leetu endured the cruel revelation of Erda's death at the hands of Erebus, yet still resisted despair. Though cast into the shadows and faced with the four Chaos gods, he survived where others would have been annihilated. This survival cannot be explained purely through martial prowess, yet it reflects a crucial aspect of his fighting style, his ability to withstand psychological and metaphysical assaults, as well as physical combat. Later accounts describe his return with Rogel Dawn and Constantine Valdor after Horus's death. Though his role in the immediate battle within the vengeful spirit had ended, he emerged alive, a rare survivor of the confrontation. His possession of the tarot card of the throne, found near the Emperor's body, further connects him to the final stages of the siege. The fact that he continued to operate coherently after the battle, sorting through his tarot deck, demonstrates his resilience. Where others were shattered, Leetu remained functional, if subdued. When comparing his combat role to that of other warriors of the heresy, certain distinctions emerge. Astartes fought as part of disciplined formations, bound by their legion's doctrines. Custodians embodied the Emperor's personal guard, paragons of genetic and martial perfection. Primarchs operated as demigods, reshaping battlefields by their mere presence. Leetu stood apart. His battles were smaller in scale, more personal, yet no less significant. He fought in duels, in corridors, in desperate defensive stands, and in the psychological arena. His style was defined by adaptability, precision, and endurance rather than overwhelming might. It is worth noting that his equipment influenced this style. The M676 bolt pistol, an older model than the standardized Mars variants, lacked some of the refinements later introduced. This required him to make every shot count, emphasizing accuracy over volume. His armor, pale silver and marked LE2, was lighter in profile than most legionary suits, granting him mobility in confined spaces. These factors shaped his combat approach: deliberate, adaptable, and personally resilient. The battles of the Horus Heresy recorded his presence most vividly, yet his role in earlier conflicts should not be dismissed. Though the records are fragmentary, it is likely that Leetu was deployed in limited engagements during the late Unification Wars or the early Great Crusade. His loyalty to Erda suggests that he was not bound to the Emperor's will, but his capabilities would have made him valuable in missions requiring precision rather than mass deployment. Administratum silence on this matter likely reflects suppression rather than absence. Thus, the notable wars and battles of Leetu are remembered in fragments, but together they paint a consistent picture. He was a warrior who fought not for conquest, nor for blind loyalty, but for protection, of Erda, of his companions, and of meaning itself. His fighting style reflected this ethos. He combined precision marksmanship with close quarters adaptability and psychological resilience with moral clarity. He stood where others faltered, enduring wounds, despair, and even the presence of the Chaos Gods themselves. Though rarely named in official records, his contribution to the greatest battle of the age cannot be denied. The wider chronicles of the Imperium, where administratum clerks attempted to account for the final decades of the Great Crusade and the devastation of the heresy, hold fragments of Leetu's presence that surface sporadically and in no predictable sequence. Many of these traces were drawn not from primary battle reports, but from requisition documents, supply orders, or post-campaign reviews filed in the aftermath of engagements where unusual factors were noted. These entries, when examined collectively, reveal a pattern of involvement in several additional conflicts beyond the most famous battles already described. They provide both a measure of Leetu's impact and the shifting administrative attitudes toward his role in events that were too sensitive to record openly. One set of records ties him to actions in the early stages of the Siege of Terror, specifically during the battles for the outer walls of the Imperial Palace. Clerks noted requisitions for replacement munitions that exceeded projections by wide margins, with margins attributed to unauthorized formations. Within the accompanying remarks, one quartermaster suggested that an individual combatant was responsible for levels of fire output that would normally be expected from a full squad of Space Marines. Though no name was entered, the administratum analyst who later collated these records placed the annotation subject consistent with Leetu. For the administratum, this was less a matter of celebrating individual valor and more an issue of accounting. Such anomalies complicated their tallies and disrupted the logistical models upon which campaigns were planned. The Mechanicus, however, preserved different impressions. Their engineers recorded fragments of sensor data from palace defense systems, many of which had been partially automated to track battlefield conditions. A recurring anomaly was identified: a single armoured figure whose movements consistently outpaced the baseline metrics of Astartes' reaction times. For the Mechanicus, this was of more than passing curiosity. If Leetu represented a prototype outside the standardized gene template of the legions, His continued survival during the palace fighting served as a living measure of genetic engineering not fully aligned with Mars-approved standards. Later Mechanicus commentaries described him as an uncalibrated model whose combat durability surpassed projections. Another notable battle reference comes from an administratum fragment describing a counter-offensive during the retreat through the Helios Gate, one of the choke points into the palace interior. Here, a report of excessive losses to the word-bearers includes a curious notation. A singular defender advanced beyond the prescribed defensive lines, enabling retreating forces to reorganize. The tone of the report indicates disapproval rather than admiration. Administratum scribes noted that such behavior risked disorder, since it diverged from the prescribed command protocols issued by Rogel Dawn's Central Defense Council. Yet Mechanicus annotations added decades later re-evaluated the episode, suggesting that the disruptive action may have reduced system losses overall, though such conclusions were deliberately left buried in appendices where few outside their order would look. Beyond Terror itself, sparse but telling mentions place Leetu in conflicts that occurred after the heresy. A Mechanicus archive dated to the immediate post-heresy decades speaks of a figure matching his description observed during clearance operations in the lunar sublevels, where remnants of traitor forces and corrupted war machines had entrenched themselves. The account noted his equipment was still functioning beyond expected lifespans, a fact which the Mechanicus evaluators found anomalous. That a prototype bolt pistol and pre-accord armour were still combat-ready years after the siege-strained conventional understanding of maintenance cycles. The suggestion, though never confirmed, was that Leetu himself had adapted techniques to keep his equipment viable in conditions of extreme neglect, further reinforcing the impression of him as both warrior and mechanic in equal measure. Administratum records concerning this period are far less generous. Several fragments show attempts to erase references to Leetu altogether, describing his involvement in clearance operations as apocryphal. For clerks invested in the narrative of centralized imperial strength, the continued activity of an irregular prototype was politically inconvenient. It drew attention to the improvised measures of the heresy's aftermath and undermined the controlled narrative of a seamless transition into the Imperium's new order. When the siege concluded and the Imperium reshaped itself under the burdens of rebuilding, both Administratum and Mechanicus commentary converged on a shared concern. What to do with a figure who embodied both potential and disruption? Administratum ledgers reveal that Leetu was eventually logged as present in custody within the palace's sealed chambers, accompanied by references to tarot decks and sustained observation. These notes suggest an effort to minimize his presence in official histories by reframing him as a subject under evaluation rather than an active participant in imperial defense. Mechanicus records, though equally cautious, betray more fascination. Marginalia in one redacted archive imply that several magi lobbied for access to study Leetu, arguing that his armor, weaponry and gene line represented a living archive of pre-standardization engineering. These requests were denied, with the notation that oversight of such matters fell under the Sigillites' jurisdiction. Nonetheless, copies of their requests circulated within the Mechanicus for centuries, ensuring that the memory of Leetu lingered as a subject of suppressed technical curiosity. The aftermath of these conflicts also shaped institutional attitudes. For the Administratum, Leetu became a cautionary example of why records must be tightly controlled. To them, the problem was not his deeds, but their implications. That an individual outside the structured command chains and unrecognized by Legion hierarchy could influence outcomes of galaxy-spanning consequence. Allowing such truths to proliferate risked undermining the carefully constructed edifice of centralized imperial authority. For the Mechanicus, the aftermath prompted more pragmatic debates. Some argued that the survival of such a prototype suggested untapped potentials in the human genome, raising questions about whether the Emperor's early methods had been discarded prematurely. Others countered that Leetu represented an unrepeatable singularity, a convergence of factors unlikely to be replicated by conventional process. In either case, their evaluations were shelved under the category of restricted observation. ensuring that knowledge of him would circulate only in the narrowest circles. Looking back across these fragments, the administratum perspective closes on a verdict of omission. Their records steer away from overt acknowledgement, preferring silence to engagement. Leetu is left as a shadow in the margins of their battle accounts, tolerated only because his presence could not be fully erased. The Mechanicus, in contrast, allowed his image to persist as a technical curiosity, filed among anomalies rather than heroes. This duality, silence on one side, fascination on the other, shaped the way his memory survived into later centuries. Thus, the additional wars and aftermath assessments do not simply expand Leetu's martial record. They illuminate the tension between two great imperial institutions, one committed to narrative control and the other to technical evaluation. In their archives, the same man is rendered either as a dangerous irregularity or as a singular example of engineering that surpassed projected limits. Both interpretations ensured that his legacy remained unresolved, preserved not in the banners of victory but in the margins of conflicting institutional memory. The archives of the Inquisition approach Leetu from a very different angle than either the Administratum or the Mechanicus. For the former, he was an administrative anomaly, for the latter a biological and technological curiosity. The Inquisition, however, considered him an existential question. To their agents, his existence represented both an opportunity to learn more about the Emperor's earliest genetic experiments and a threat to the stability of imperial orthodoxy. What emerges from their records is a layered evaluation, part interrogation, part observation, and part containment. The earliest documents bearing inquisitorial seals date to the immediate aftermath of the Siege of Terra. A surviving notation in the Ordo Hereticus vaults describes an anomalous proto-legionary in silver warplate marked with the designation LE2. This record emphasizes his unorthodox origin, stressing that his gene line was not traceable to any of the sanctioned Primarch projects. The mere fact of his survival beyond the heresy drew attention. For Inquisitors, a figure who had fought beside the Emperor in the final confrontation with Horus, yet stood outside the structure of the legions, was a paradox. He embodied both legitimacy and irregularity, and therefore demanded scrutiny. Reports from the first formal interrogations reveal the Inquisition's unease. Agents noted that Leetu's demeanour was calm, cooperative, and even reflective, yet his loyalty was consistently expressed toward Erda rather than to the Emperor. This disturbed the interrogators, for it implied a devotion not to the centre of imperial authority, but to an exile who had defied the Emperor's designs. Their evaluations described this as a deviation of allegiance. One particularly terse assessment went further, labelling it a heretical sentiment if left unaddressed. The fact that Leetu never openly defied imperial order did little to soften this judgment. The Inquisition viewed loyalties as absolutes. Any deviation was recorded as potential corruption. The Ordo Xenos, though less concerned with questions of heresy, nonetheless considered Leetu relevant to their work. They noted that his genetic baseline represented a branch of the Emperor's experimentation that was otherwise extinct. Some of their commentary speculates whether his creation drew upon non-human biomaterial, though such claims are marked as unsubstantiated. The possibility, however faint, that the first Space Marine might contain extraneous elements was sufficient to justify ongoing observation under their remit. Malleus Archivist argued that his survival through such warp-saturated conditions without evidence of corruption warranted investigation. Some saw this as proof of incorruptible genetic stability, while others suspected latent influence that had simply not yet manifested. Their conclusion was neither celebratory nor dismissive. They categorized him as anomalously resilient. In inquisitorial terms, this designation was less commendation than a red flag. The most detailed impressions come from restricted files preserved under the seal of Malcador's successors. These accounts describe Leetu not in terms of battlefield action, but in the context of his final documented state, seated calmly with a tarot deck, awaiting interrogation. Observers were unsettled by the tranquility of his demeanour. Here was a warrior who had walked through the burning palace, fought alongside demigods, and confronted the warp itself, yet who now presented himself as patient, silent, and seemingly without fear. One inquisitor remarked that such composure suggests either profound acceptance or knowledge not shared. Another described it as the bearing of one who knows more than he will speak. Ethically, the Inquisition's impressions oscillated between suspicion and reluctant respect. He was never recorded as openly defiant, yet his mere existence was a problem. His loyalty to Erda was never announced, which left him perpetually on the margins of imperial orthodoxy. His possession of pre-standardized weaponry and armor was noted as contraband. His artistic habit of sketching, documented by interrogators who confiscated several of his drawings, was interpreted as a potential form of coded communication. Even his tarot deck, which he used not for divination but for quiet contemplation, was catalogued as an object of interest. To the Inquisition, no detail was trivial if it might conceal hidden meaning. It is telling that their reports rarely mention his battlefield skill except in passing. Where the Mechanicus praised his resilience and Administratum scribes lamented his unpredictability, the Inquisition focused almost entirely on matters of origin, allegiance, and psychology. They considered not the wars he had fought, but the possibility of what he represented, an unsanctioned space marine prototype, bound to a figure who had stood against the Emperor, yet touched directly by the Emperor himself in the last hours of the heresy. Such contradictions were intolerable to bureaucracies obsessed with control. Speculation within the Ordo Hereticus records that he may have known of Erda's death, even before it was confirmed by other sources added further complexity. If true, it implied channels of awareness that the Inquisition could neither explain nor regulate. They did not claim warp sensitivity, but the possibility was raised. His subsequent confrontation with entities in the Imperium, an episode only fragmentarily described, was treated as both alarming and intriguing. Surviving reports describe him cast into shadows and standing against four great forms, references understood as confrontations with the Chaos Gods themselves. That he returned intact was sufficient to mark him for indefinite study. From these layers of record, the overall inquisitorial impression can be distilled. They viewed Leetu not as hero or villain, but as unresolved data. To some, he was an accident of history, a living remainder of abandoned designs. To others, he was a dangerous precedent, proof that loyalty might attach to figures outside the imperial center. To a few, perhaps the most curious, he was an invaluable key, evidence of techniques and survivals that might inform future understanding of both the warp and the Emperor's genetic craft. Yet in all cases, the Inquisition avoided conclusion. Their files remain open-ended, filled with annotations, but devoid of verdict. This ambiguity is deliberate. Inquisitors are trained to consider not only what is known, but what cannot be known, and in Leetu they found a subject resistant to closure. He was the first of his kind, yet not counted among them, the Emperor's creation, yet devoted to another, a survivor of the heresy, yet erased from its public histories. The Inquisition, unwilling to allow such contradictions into the wider discourse, confined them to their vaults. For this reason, the Inquisition's impression of Leetu is one of permanent suspension. He is neither condemned nor celebrated, neither free nor wholly contained. He exists as a file never closed, a case perpetually awaiting review. This, in the logic of the Inquisition, may be the highest form of control, not judgment, but indefinite observation. The Inquisition's deeper records surrounding Leetu contain not only impressions, but scattered reports of anomalies in war zones, engagements, and encounters where his presence defied the expectations of archivists. These documents are sparse, often heavily redacted, and in many cases marked as sealed, but the surviving fragments allow a picture of his irregular military record to emerge. What unites them is a pattern of appearances in battles where his presence was either unexpected or unexplained, combined with a tendency for his contributions to be removed from official narratives. The first category of anomalies concerns the Siege of Terror itself. Within the sanctioned accounts of the battle, the Argonauts John Grammaticus, Olanius Persson, Actae, and their companions appear only in fleeting mention, if at all. Yet sealed transcripts from inquisitorial interrogations reveal detailed testimony describing Leetu's actions in critical junctures of the palace defense. He is described aiding person in rallying defenders, fighting word-bearers within the catacombs, and even shielding Grammaticus from a killing blow. These details were excised from wider Imperium-wide accounts. Administrators explain this as the removal of non-essential material, but inquisitorial notes suggest it was deliberate suppression. The reason, though unstated, is implied. The inclusion of an unsanctioned legionary prototype in the most sacred Imperial defense would have raised uncomfortable questions. A second anomaly appears in records of the confrontation within the Imperial dungeon. Surviving testimony states that the Emperor addressed Leetu by name. This is one of the rare cases in which the Master of Mankind is recorded as personally acknowledging a transhuman warrior other than the Primarchs or trusted companions like Malcador. Official histories omit this entirely, while inquisitorial commentary stresses that such recognition cannot be ignored. It is unclear whether the Emperor had retained memory of Leetu's creation, or whether this acknowledgement was symbolic, yet the Inquisition judged it significant enough to classify the moment as a sealed priority. Additional battle reports reference Leetu during the final boarding actions aboard the Vengeful Spirit. Most Imperial accounts describe the assault force as composed of the Emperor, Rogel Dawn, Sanguinius, Valdor, and other named champions. Yet within a set of Mechanicus data slate fragments recovered from the wreck, his pale silver armour is described among the boarding party. Further, there is record of him retrieving the body of Sanguinius from a suspended state and defending it against encroaching warp manifestations. This action does not appear in official martyrdom accounts of the Primarch, which emphasize Sanguinius's death at Horus's hand without reference to any subsequent recovery. Inquisitorial records interpret this as deliberate narrative reshaping, ensuring that the tale of Sanguinius remained one of singular sacrifice untainted by auxiliary intervention. One of the most striking sealed reports concerns his disappearance into the shadows of Lupercal's court. The testimony describes him cast aside by Horus and exposed directly to the manifested forms of the four ruinous powers. Few mortals survive such exposure, and even fewer are returned intact. The account states that the gods recoiled, withdrawing their attention after Horus's death. That Leetu was able to endure even moments of such proximity without corruption or annihilation is regarded by inquisitorial archivists as a statistical impossibility. This file is locked under Ordo Malleus seal, accompanied by the warning that knowledge of the event should not be permitted into common discourse for fear of undermining the claim that only the Emperor could resist such powers. Other anomalies are more fragmentary. One file references his use of a tarot deck after the battle, the cards reportedly containing symbols not entirely consistent with standard Imperial decks. The presence of a card titled The Throne is mentioned specifically. Administratum scribes noted that the card was instrumental in convincing Dawn to place the Emperor on the Golden Throne, a moment pivotal to Imperial survival. Yet no official tarot card of that name is recorded in the era. The Inquisition speculated whether Leetu himself had produced the card or discovered it under unknown circumstances. Regardless of origin, it was quietly removed from record, leaving only a sealed annotation acknowledging its existence. Some battle anomalies are less well defined, consisting of scattered reports from survivors who claim to have seen a silver-armoured warrior who did not match any Legion heraldry. These accounts appear in testimonies from the Saturnine Gate, the walls of the inner palace, and the catacombs beneath the sanctum. In each case, descriptions align with Leetu's armour and weaponry. The Inquisition gathered these accounts, cross-referenced them, and then suppressed them from official archives. The rationale, as one marginalia explains, was that the existence of such a figure blurs the boundaries between myth and sanctioned truth. Beyond Terra, anomalies in recorded encounters appear sporadically in the following centuries. Several sealed reports within Ordo Xenos archives claim Leetu was sighted on the fringes of compliance wars in the Segmentum Solar, though no evidence of his participation survives beyond vague description. These sightings are considered unconfirmed, but their recurrence prompted debate among archivists as to whether he remained active beyond the heresy. At least one file raises the possibility that he was quietly redeployed under inquisitorial watch, though this claim remains unverified. The most heavily redacted records concern a single sealed encounter labelled Argent Warrior. The document is preserved only as fragments, with whole sections obliterated by censors. What survives describes a warrior in pale armour intervening during a demon incursion on an unnamed Forge world. The description matches Leetu's appearance closely, down to the distinct beak helm. The report states that he stabilised the defence long enough for reinforcements to arrive, then vanished. The Mechanicus record listed him as a non-standard Astartes asset, but the Inquisition reclassified the file and withdrew it from general access. Whether this was truly Leetu or an error of identification remains unresolved. Taken together, these anomalies form a pattern of erasure and contradiction. Where Leetu appeared, the record is incomplete, altered, or sealed. Where he acted, his role was minimized or attributed elsewhere. Where he was acknowledged, the acknowledgement was removed. The Inquisition's approach to these anomalies was not to resolve them, but to contain them. Their archives are filled with warnings about allowing his existence to destabilize established narratives of the Emperor, the Primarchs, and the Legions. Yet the sealed reports also reveal the enduring puzzle he posed. He was the first of the Space Marines, yet unclaimed by any Legion. He was acknowledged by the Emperor, yet remembered by no official histories. He stood in the presence of chaos itself, yet returned whole. To the Inquisition, these anomalies were not simply historical curiosities. They were reminders that the Imperium's foundations contain fractures, and that certain truths must remain buried to preserve stability. Thus, the Inquisition's records of Leetu are less a history than a series of interruptions, moments where his presence threatened to disrupt the narrative of imperial control. Their solution was not to clarify, but to seal. In the logic of their archives, omission became protection. The anomalies remain recorded but behind locked vaults, accessible only to those permitted to confront the unresolved shadows of the past. The sealed archives of the Ordo Astartes contain fragments of dossiers classified at the Omega Red Tier, accessible only to High Lords and certain inquisitorial overseers. Within these forbidden records lies the most complete attempt at reconstructing the existence and influence of the figure known as Leetu, alleged to have been the first transhuman warrior of the Emperor. The preservation of these files was not without internal resistance, for their very survival contradicts both the authorized chronicles of the Legiones Astartes and the canonical histories of the Unification Wars. The compiled evidence suggests that Leetu may represent a transitional phase of biocreation, an entity situated between the Thunder Warriors and the fully realized Legiones Astartes. His physiology, equipment, and methods remain inconsistent with the later, mass-produced gene seed program, further hinting that he was not merely one among many prototypes, but an isolated experiment with specific objectives known only to the Emperor himself. Several reports indicate that the Emperor directly oversaw Leetu's deployments, restricting his exposure to both mortal allies and Thunder Warrior cadres. This behaviour is noted by some inquisitorial historians as symptomatic of the Emperor's preference for compartmentalization, wherein experimental constructs were rarely allowed to influence one another lest their failures compound. Cross-referencing multiple administratum, mechanicus, and military logs, the Inquisition notes a disconcerting pattern. Leetu's battlefield records often vanish precisely at the moment of decisive victory or catastrophic loss. Administratum dispatches describing his deployment in territorial unification efforts around the Pan-Pacific regions are marked by sudden redactions and replacement notations declaring standard Thunder Warrior involvement. Meanwhile, Mechanicus reports on gene forging compatibility studies mention a prime subject designated L01, yet this identifier is conspicuously absent from subsequent archives. The consistency of these erasures indicates deliberate removal, almost certainly sanctioned at the highest levels. More troubling are the sealed psychological assessments compiled by Proto-Astartes Medici personnel. Leetu is described as exhibiting an instinctive adherence to honor-based combat, a tendency that conflicted with the ruthless efficiency demanded of Thunder Warrior campaigns. Unlike his peers, he's recorded as sparing defeated opponents when circumstances allowed, and of engaging in ritualized conduct before engagements. Some Inquisitors interpret this as a precursor to the later warrior codes of certain legions, though others dismiss it as myth-making retroactively imposed by those sympathetic to his legend. The final sealed file, marked "Do Not Circulate, Inquisitorial Eyes Only," carries the Emperor's own sigil and a single line of notation: "Preserve the record, but let no legion bear his name." This command, paradoxically both protecting and erasing Leetu's legacy, has driven centuries of speculation among Inquisitors and scholars alike. Why the Emperor would preserve fragments of such a figure's existence while forbidding acknowledgement remains unknown. In conclusion, the Inquisition's final perspective is cautious but definitive. Leetu is neither to be enshrined as myth nor discarded as fabrication. He represents an anomaly, an origin point deliberately obscured, a weapon forged for a purpose never disclosed. His existence demonstrates the Emperor's willingness to test singular constructs before committing to broader designs, yet also the Emperor's preference for eliminating potential distractions from his grand vision. In the hidden consensus of the Ordo, Leetu is described as the shadow of the first blade drawn, but never permitted to strike twice. His name is to remain absent from official records, his story confined to the deepest vaults, known only to those who guard the Imperium's most dangerous truths.